This is Rogers TV.
Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
My guest today came to Newfoundland and Labrador as a 17-year-old refugee from the Kosovo War. He went on to become Newfoundland's 100th Rhodes Scholar. For a time, he was honorary chairman of the Newfoundland and Labrador Human Rights Commission. It's my pleasure to welcome Remzi Cej to the program. Nice to see you, friend.
It's wonderful to be here, Karl. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'd like to take you back, Remzi, to the period of the war in Kosovo. This was a time, of course, when thousands of people were experiencing something which was absolutely nightmarish. And you, as a child, had an experience when you were in school in Mitrovica, and it had to do with a protest that was happening outside of your school. And I'd just like you to talk about that experience, because I think it's a good way to illustrate exactly what you were kind of having to go through at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the defining moments of my childhood. It was I remember very early in the fall. It was the beginning of the school year, and my school was in downtown Mitrovica. My mother was coming to pick me up from work, and our teacher, who was worried about student protests outside, and they were political protests from students seeking greater rights for the Albanian majority in Kosovo. They were being attacked by the police, who were throwing smoke gas, and later it was found that they even used nerve gas on the protesters. And so my teacher had grabbed these towels that she essentially just put in water, soaked them, and she covered the windows and the doors leading to the classroom so that the gas wouldn't get in. And even with that, I think many of us were starting to get teary-eyed, and we couldn't understand why, and we had burning in our eyes. And I remember when my mother came, just as our school day ended, I couldn't wait to get out of there, but when we went out, it was even worse. So at the age of 7, having that memory at a very young age does leave an impression on you in terms of just conflict and that being at the forefront of your mind from a very young age.
You have said that it troubles you a little when you hear people say things like, well, I can't imagine what it's like to go through a war or to be in a war zone or
Right.
to experience anything like that. Mm-hmm. Because in your view, the imagination can be used as a tool to, along with your own personal experiences of life, mm-hmm. to connect and empathize with people who have gone through things like what you went through. And there's another lovely story which I'd like you to tell, which I think is somewhat illustrative. And it's when you and your mom first arrived here. You were in a grocery store, mm-hmm. and you met a lady whose husband was a fisherman. Tell us that story.
That story, I think, in many ways captures what you just spoke about, the ability that people have to imagine beyond their own experiences. And I think the power of imagination really helps us build that empathy. When we deny that imagination, equally, we become much less empathetic and understanding of other people. And I guess for us, that was a very challenging moment at the time. We had gone out sightseeing outside of St. John's, and our sponsors, friends who had volunteered to bring a family to Newfoundland and Labrador as, from former refugee background, and that was us, were giving us essentially a tour of the different communities outside of St. John's. And I remember being in this store with jars of jam and pickles and relish, and I'd never tried relish before, so this was my first time buying it. And we were waiting in the lineup when we heard from the cashier about a lady who was in the store, and her husband had gone missing. He was a fisher and he had gone missing, and she didn't know where he was, but she was convinced that he was alive and he would someday come back to her. And she refused to acknowledge that the sea had essentially taken him and he would never be found. And at that moment, I think what left an impression on me forever was just the fact that my mother, who at the time didn't know where her son was, my brother was missing for 6 years because of the war, could really empathize with this lady whose pain she could understand from her own vantage point as a mother, as somebody who had a family member missing. But I think the most striking part was that the cashier, who had never gone through either of these experiences, as my mother explained to her what had happened to us, actually empathized with both of us, and you could see tears streaming down her face, because she knew very deep inside that losing somebody is a very human experience, and you don't have to go through the experience of losing a dear family member or not know where they are to empathize with them. That day has forever, I think, been seared in my mind as this moment when I realized you didn't have to go through somebody's very real experience of loss to be able to, I guess, extend a hand up and to understand them. And to walk a journey with them, not necessarily physically the same way that they are going, but to walk alongside with them.
Absolutely. I think it's worthwhile going back to what your experiences in Kosovo were like prior to the war. Were they happy times? What was the experience like before? And you're so young. I mean, I know.
Well, thank you, Karl. I'm not sure, but thank you.
I'm quite sure that you know.
I didn't pay you for that.
You probably weren't around that many years before the war actually happened, were you?
Yeah, the political situation in former Yugoslavia really began to change in the early 80s after the death of Tito. And I was born 3 years after Tito passed away. So a lot of my childhood, parts that I don't remember, that fortunately books and YouTube documentaries help you rediscover or discover for the first time, was marked by this tumultuous time when there was a lot of tension, political tension, and ethnic tension and just challenges that many Kosovars were going through. And all of that culminated in 1990 with Slobodan Milosevic getting at the helm or the top of the Communist Party and Yugoslavia as a federation. So if you think of the Federation of Yugoslavia, all these small republics similar to how the provinces in Canada are, Kosovo was a province within the Republic of Serbia that had its own autonomy and its own decision-making powers. So as I went through my childhood, these political problems weren't something that happened elsewhere or something that I distantly related to. It was something that I experienced on a daily basis. So, you know, the neighboring war in Bosnia, for example, began in '92 as the Serbian military was accused of committing war crimes there and became involved in the war very actively. The international community imposed sanctions on Serbia. But those sanctions didn't only impact Serbia, it impacted families like mine. So Kosovo is very much in Europe, it's in Southern Europe. But if I describe to you the stories of waiting in lineups to get bread in 1993 or 94 for hours at a time because there were flour shortages because of European sanctions and international community sanctions, it would seem like an image from somewhere that you have associated with very much a war zone. And yet, 6 or 7 hours away drive, Greece was full of tourists from Canada and all kinds of places. So it was a childhood that was very much marked by some of these tumultuous political situations, but it was also a childhood where I got to discover a lot of what eventually or later became who I was. Eurovision, which is my favorite song contest, became my go-to TV show and a program that we talk with friends, and languages became something I became very interested in because of music and TV channels that we watched from across the world. And when you have access to the world and you see how other people live and languages they speak, and you have that encouragement from your parents to really discover the world and within this confine where you live, it pushes you and it inspires you to want to find a way in. And for me, it was through languages. So I spoke Albanian and Turkish and Serbian, and very quickly began learning other languages like English, French, German, and eventually Spanish, because of that desire of just wanting to learn more about the world. And it helps when you're surrounded by friends who want to do the same. So it becomes somewhat of a competition.
So when you and your family got out of Kosovo after the war,
yeah.
You were in a refugee camp. How is it, well, I was going to say, how is it you ended up coming to Canada? But before you answer that, what were you feeling when you were in that camp? Was it despair? Was it relief? Did you have hope? What were you feeling?
I would say all of those things, and sometimes all at once. We were relieved that we were no longer in a war zone. We were in a refugee camp where we knew nobody would attack us. There wouldn't be bombs thrown at us. We wouldn't be forced out. And yet at the same time, we had no plan for the future because we couldn't plan. Refugee camps are places created for a temporary solution. And yet there are refugee camps around the world that have become permanent refugee camps, places like Lebanon, parts of Kenya where they have Somali refugees, where generations of people have grown up in refugee camps. That can make planning for the future very difficult. And I think that's where hope begins to wane, because you're not able to think about what your plans could be. You can't pursue education meaningfully. And what's worst is you don't know where you can ground yourself. As a refugee, you're stateless, so you can't belong to the country where you're being temporarily housed. And as such, you can't really make plans for finding a job, pursuing education, none of those plans, which is why when resettlement becomes an option to be resettled to a third country, so from your home country you end up in a refugee camp, a second country, and then resettling to a third country, that was probably the best thing that could have happened to us, because it allowed us to begin life or return to life with some sort of a sense of normalcy. I could go back to school, my parents could begin learning English, I began working and volunteering and just really trying to catch up on all these things I'd missed for a year and a half in many ways while being in that refugee camp situation. And to be honest, we didn't spend as long a time as some people spend in refugee camps. We were there for a year and a half. And during that time, we switched through 7 different refugee camps. I've often described it as a perfect exercise in minimalism, because the more you move from one camp to another, the fewer belongings you can carry, yes, because it gets heavy after a while. So it wasn't as long as it could have been, but it was definitely a disconcerting experience for all of us, to go from living in your own home, to have your own garden with vegetables and fruit and neighbors, to sharing a tent with another family, having no privacy at all, not being able to pursue education or employment. All of this is very debilitating, and I think as humans were taught to have dignity and pursue independence and our life satisfaction, refugee camps are built for a temporary solution. They're not intended to be a place where you can pursue any of those options.
So, Canada, how is it you ended up coming to Canada, and specifically to St. John's, Newfoundland?
Well, at the time, as the war was progressing, my parents and I sought resettlement from Albania to another country. And Canada has a very active refugee resettlement program. They expressed an interest in resettling my family, along with many others. Between 1999 and 2000, Canada resettled 5,000 refugees as part of an operation to resettle refugees from the war. And so my family was among 5,000 Kosovars who ended up across the country. Here in the province, I believe there were 12 families that arrived. Some of them were originally in CFB Gagetown in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, in parts of Nova Scotia, and then moved to here as a more permanent solution. Others returned. Many people returned after the war ended because they could see that being so far away from home was not something they could endure. It's very difficult when you've grown up in a small community with everybody around you going thousands of kilometers away from that spot. When we were added to that initial list of refugees who could be resettled, that was then followed up by a request for volunteers, sponsors, as they are called, community volunteers who expressed an interest in helping us settle and integrate in the community. And here in the province, it was a lovely number of families who opted to come to the airport and greet us and help us get to know communities in and outside of the Avalon.
What was your reaction to Newfoundland when you came here? I mean, it must have seemed quite different from...
Yeah, it was. To come from a community or a background where the population density is very high to a province where that density is very low was definitely a shock. And I think that started from the day we landed, when we looked down and we could see all this beautiful water, but eventually we didn't because it was a foggy day. But it was definitely striking. Challenging for my parents because at their age, it was difficult to build or rebuild a social network in a community where they didn't speak the language, at least not for a number of years. My mother eventually became an interpreter, impressively as somebody who didn't speak the language before, but it took time. I found it very easy to adjust to, and I think looking back, it was a perfect opportunity to begin working through some of the experiences and emotions that I had shelved or set aside while I was in a refugee camp. Because during those times, you're simply thinking about survival and making it through the day, and you're not focusing on reflecting on what just happened to you. So it was a lovely community to settle in and adjust in and adapt in and really restart our lives. And it was made all the better by these volunteers who we had never met before, who came to this airport that was at the time being renovated. So there was dust falling off the ceiling and all kinds of things happening, but they made it very real. That, you know, the place we had settled in was not about the fog and about the cold and the wind. It was about the people who inhabited it and who made it a home. And for us,
wonderful.
That first day.
Had you finished high school before you came here, or did you complete high school here?
I went to Holy Heart here. I had completed the first year of high school back home, and when I moved to St. John's, that meant, because I couldn't prove how I had obtained my first year of high school, and I didn't have any documentation, I had to go through the full 3 years of high school in St. John's. And in some ways that gave me an opportunity to really kind of plan out what I wanted to do and think thoroughly what I wanted to pursue in my future, which evolved from time to time, and not least because I have a lot of passions and I enjoy doing a lot of things, and so I'd try something and really enjoy it, then I'd try something else and really liked it, and so it for many teenagers, it changed very frequently, but it was great to have that privilege of being able to choose what I wanted to do.
And then in 2010, you received the Rhodes Scholarship. You were Newfoundland and Labrador's 100th Rhodes Scholar. My goodness, how did you feel when you were awarded the Rhodes?
Yeah, it was actually 2008, but
2008.
I was,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
I thought it was 2010.
It was surreal, and not as surreal as going there. I think a lot of people were telling me about the meaning of Rhodes. I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship, to be frank, because I wanted to pursue my studies and wanted to find a way in which I could pay for some of my education. And I applied for Rhodes with that strictly in mind. After obtaining it, it really hit home when I started getting calls from the media and from my professors saying this is incredible, because I sent them all an email just to let them know that I'd received this. And social media was a very new thing at the time, so I started getting all these emails from friends and from family and from my instructors who were really impressed, and I started to think, this is something big. I was very happy with just the interview experience that I'd had, because I remember reflecting on this while sitting on this table that was one of the oldest dining tables in North America at Government House. Mm-hmm. And pondering, just thinking about how privileged I was and everybody around me was to be in this space and to think about just the opportunities that I had been offered and afforded. But to see that then become a real scholarship and real opportunity to study at Oxford University, it was beyond anything I had imagined to that point. And it became very real the day that I got to Oxford, and then a few days later had to wear a cap and gown in order to be matriculated, to become an official student, and meet friends from all around the world.
You studied international relations at Oxford, and your thesis dealt with international conflict and how being exposed to conflict impacts civilians, but especially children, women, and seniors. I'm just curious, I want to ask you, how are things in Kosovo now?
Mm-hmm. Probably the primary reason I wanted to study post-conflict nation building was to learn myself more about the lingering effects of conflict on people and on development of countries and societies. And I felt I did that at the time. I feel like these days Kosovo and the region are evolving in such a fast way that none of us anticipated politically and economically. And things, while they're much better, people are no longer experiencing physical violence and armed violence. The lingering impacts of the war are still there. So there's still division between ethnicities. There are still efforts being made by neighboring Serbian politicians to undermine Kosovo and its efforts at statehood. So it's a work in progress, if you will.
Remzi, it's been wonderful having you on the program. Thanks so much for being with us.
Wonderful to be here again, Karl.
Okay.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. And that is it for this edition of Karl Wells' Point to Point. Please join us again next time.